In Acts chapter 17, the city of Thessalonica is in an uproar. A mob riot has started, and the men of the city are shouting before the town council, "These men who have turned the world upside down have also come here." Looking in on this scene, it would seem like an invading force has ascended upon the city of Thessalonica, looting the streets, spreading anarchy, and causing no small disturbance. But who were these men, and how are they turning the world upside down? The ones causing this chaos were the Apostle Paul and his friends, and they weren't advocating violent insurgency or anarchy. They were simply talking about a man who was once dead and was now alive. In short, they were evangelizing, sharing the good news of Jesus Christ with those they came into contact with. And they weren't even doing this in the public square, but in the local synagogue and in private homes. As Christians, we all know the importance and necessity of evangelism, telling others about Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. We are all familiar with our commission as Christian believers to share the gospel with non-Christians. And we want our friends and our neighbors to repent, to have faith, and to embrace Jesus Christ. For we know the message of the gospel can turn their lives and even the world upside down. But I often think that we're neglecting some of Paul's methods in that evangelism. We see Paul in Thessalonica preaching to the synagogue for 3 consecutive Sabbath days. So 3 consecutive Saturdays, his public proclamation of the gospel is noteworthy. For that is our pattern even today. We faithfully proclaim the gospel from the pulpit in our church every weekend so that Christians may be reminded of it and non-Christians may be confronted with it. We should always and consistently proclaim the good news of Christ publicly in our church meetings. Yet today, one of the places where it is increasingly difficult to do evangelism is inside the church itself. That's because the non-Christian is typically not there. Approximately 85 million people in the United States have no intention, no desire to attend a church service. You may think those people must live in some of those big cities, on a coast, or in the more liberal regions of our country. But consider Chattanooga, the most biblically minded city in America. Even with our 418 evangelical Protestant churches, more than 40% of our neighbors will claim no religious affiliation. That's over 70,000 people who do not attend and most likely have no intention of ever attending a church service, even ones with a dope Instagram feed, a rocking band, and free taco nights. Moving forward, these church campus events will not draw a mass of unchurched or de-churched individuals to the gospel. And as the generations grow younger, the appeal to attend an event at a local church where they can hear the gospel is even less likely to be effective. So with the masses of non-Christians, and especially the young non-Christians, if they are not in church to be introduced to Jesus, how do we do effective evangelism? Simply, we take our gospel and go home. Now this is in no way an appeal to disband our local church, sell the property, stop all programming and events. I am not appealing to you to be like a spoiled kid who gets mad at the church game, takes his ball, and sulks home. Church gatherings, services, and events are highly valuable for several reasons, but they cannot and should not be our primary means to evangelize our friends and neighbors. When we look back at Paul in Thessalonica, we can see him preaching on those Sabbath days. But what was he doing for the other days during the week? How did he occupy his time to have such a radical impact on that city? It would seem that he was spending most of his time with other people, hanging out in their homes, eating meals together, and having conversations about spiritual matters and the gospel. And we know he wasn't just hanging out with saved church people. Why do we know that? Because there was no church at that time. Almost everyone he met was not yet a Christian, making most of the conversations he had evangelistic. While we do not know exactly how Paul spent his time, Acts 17 is silent on his Tuesday afternoon agenda. The 2nd chapter of 1 Thessalonians describes his ministry among the people there. In your small group discussion time in just a few moments, you will read that chapter and discuss some questions. But let me point out two quick observations about Paul's evangelistic ministry. First, Paul's ministry was not only proclamational, it was incarnational. He lived among the people of Thessalonica. He will say this, "We, so being affectionately desirous of you, we were ready to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you had become very dear to us." We see here that Paul gave of himself. He lived among the people and shared life with them. He was bodily present with them, not just on Sabbath mornings, but daily in their homes. Second, we see that Paul's ministry was conversational. Paul often did not stand up and provide a monologue each time he presented the gospel. If you look back in Acts 17 in verses 2 and 3, we see that Paul reasoned with them. He explained details. He provided proofs of the trustworthiness and truthfulness of his message. To reason with someone is to have a dialogue, to exchange questions. Explanations take time to clarify, interact, and talk through the scripture. Providing proofs takes diligence and patience to present evidence, handle rebuttals, and give answers when and where needed. Paul was always respectful and dignified. He gave the people time to think, to process, and to move toward his position. The people in verse 4 were persuaded, not pressured. They were convinced of the gospel truth, not coerced. Paul was not lobbing spiritual grenades at them, cramming information down their throats, or badgering people for a response. No, he allowed for questions and extended dialogue, and he opened himself up as he lived among the people. Paul's example here instructs us on how we are to practice evangelism as well. So when we think about sharing Christ with our closest friends and neighbors, we need to take Paul's approach. This approach I am calling hospitable evangelism. Hospitable evangelism is strategically opening our lives and homes to the stranger to welcome, love, serve, and share Jesus with them. By intentionally making ourselves and our homes available for others, we can effectively practice hospitable evangelism through personal and spiritual conversations. So how do we become hospitable evangelists? Primarily, we must have an open heart before we can have an open home. So here I want to give you two heart postures that we should develop in order to practice hospitable evangelism in our lives and in our homes. The first posture is that we must be available. I can remember being a member at a church where we did Monday night visitation and evangelism training. One night, I went out with a senior pastor and we visited with a guy in his early 20s who had recently attended a community event that we had put on. This guy had very little interest in us, in the church, or in what we had to say. I think he was much more interested to go back inside and watch some more SportsCenter. But before we left the porch, the pastor insisted that I regurgitate the entire gospel outline, even though this guy had no desire to hear it. So we presented the gospel, we left him a bag of material, invited him back to church, and promptly never saw him again. Yet once we got back to the church and debriefed for the rest of the group, the pastor was so proud that we had shared the full gospel that night and how we were such successful evangelists. That didn't seem like success to me. It seemed more like a drive-by shooting. We had shot up this guy's front porch with a hollow 5-point outline filled with leaded scripture references. It occurred to me then that a more successful approach to evangelism might have been to go inside, grab a soda, and watch ESPN with this guy, and to build up a trust, a rapport, and maybe even a friendship. We should not see evangelism as unloading spiritual and gospel truth upon somebody as quick as possible. We are not salesmen seeking to close the sale, hastily moving on to the next customer. We need to see our non-Christian neighbors not as needy customers needing a miracle product hawked by some suave salesman, but as someone wandering, lost, on a journey who is in need of a fellow traveler. And as a fellow traveler, we must commit to walking with our neighbors through the highs and the lows, through the questions, through the concerns. In short, we must be available to live life with them over the long haul, not just throwing a 4-point outline on their at their feet on the front porch and then moving on our way. We must travel the road with them. Paul could have easily preached the gospel to the Thessalonians for a couple of hours and then moved on to more comfortable and easier cities. But Paul ended up spending some significant time with the church and corresponded with them frequently after he left. He was not content to drop off some gospel tracts and bolt for the next place. No, he allowed himself to be open and available to the people in the church there because he cared for them, because he loved them. This is our call as well, to openly share our lives with those who do not know Jesus because we love them. We understand their desperate need for the gospel and we desire for them to know Jesus Christ. So we make ourselves available to them. Second, we must live with intention. Practicing hospitable evangelism will not come about on its own. We cannot have a home mission someday when the kids get over, some days when we have a bigger living room, some days when I learn how to cook, someday when I have more time. Someday is not a day on the weekly calendar. We must intentionally plan in our schedules and in our budgets to invite other people, and specifically our friends and neighbors, into our lives and into our homes. Hospitality does have a cost, and it's often steep. It takes time, money, and energy. This is a cost we must be willing to make, because life and death really do hang in the balance. But don't think that you have to create some extra hours during the week. Building friendships through hospitable evangelism doesn't mean increasing the number of events on your calendar. We must learn how to incorporate people into our everyday practices and routines. Think about the activities and weekly routines that you are already doing. For instance, you probably eat around 20 to 21 times a week. What coworker can you grab lunch with? Who can you have over to your house for Taco Tuesdays? And there are many other opportunities in your life and in your schedule. Think about it. If you are running errands and going to the store, who can you take along with you? Going downtown to the farmer's market this weekend, what family can you invite to tag along? Moms, are there families with small children on your street? How can you set up a play date to get the kids and the moms together during the week? Are you watching your kids' incredibly boring soccer game? How many other parents are sitting around you? How many conversations can you have on the bleachers? Or think about if you and your neighbor enjoy the same sports or the same movies, or if you're both watching the same channel on TV at the same time but in two different houses. Why not consider watching the game or the show or the movie together at your place? Or is a holiday coming up? Well, break out the grill and celebrate with others in your neighborhood. We should seek to involve others in what we are already doing and when we are already eating. There are daily, weekly, and annual events that we must intentionally leverage to connect with other people, to live as a Christian neighbor, and to build friendships, and to have opportunities for evangelism. We can easily practice hospitality in our everyday life. As we consider Paul's example in Thessalonica, many of us need to reevaluate how we can better practice hospitable evangelism. Because if we look at our society today, we increasingly live isolated, frenetic lives. Perhaps more now than ever before are we overwhelmed with busyness. I will argue that living such a hurried, frantic life, rushing here and there, is not how Jesus wants us to live our lives as His disciples. We must learn to build some margin into our lives, in our schedule and in our budget. And not just extra downtime for self-care, but for the service and love of others. In order to be genuinely hospitable, we must be willing to be inconvenienced and interruptible. We should be asking ourselves, do I intentionally live at a pace that allows me to be available to those around me? If I do not have any margin in my life, are the things that occupy my time more important than the Great Commission? In order to be available and intentional about hospitality and evangelism, we may need to plan time to simply hang out with the neighbors and eat some good food together.